All right, so let's talk about different types of muscular tissue. This should be a little bit of review at this point. So the three types of muscle are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. You could see that the other name for smooth is sometimes they call it visceral because we find around the visceral organs like the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract. Skeleton earns its name because we find it in its location attached to the skeletal system. And oftentimes you'll hear the term musculoskeletal system, right? The musculoskeletal system, because muscles attached to the skeleton, the bones don't really act by themselves. They can't locomote or move by themselves. Muscles and tendons have to act upon them. So skeletal muscle is voluntary, it's consciously controlled, whereas cardiac and smooth muscle, you can see both of those are involuntary because you can't increase your heart rate on command. You can't make the uterus contract on command. Now, I would agree that if you're stressed, right, your heart rate is beating 130, 140 beats per minute, and you're anxious, but then you put on some nice relaxing music, a little glass of red wine, and you meditate, you can then decrease your heart rate, right? So you can control it, you just can't do it on command instantaneously, like contracting your biceps muscle or triceps muscle. So therefore, cardiac is involuntary. Smooth muscle is involuntary. When I think of smooth muscle, you should be thinking of things like organs, the bronchi, the small intestine, the large intestine, arteries, right? Things that are in tubes that can constrict or dilate. Constrict or dilate. It's the smooth muscle that wraps around it that can do that. Muscles produce body movement. We know that because muscles connect to bones, and when muscles exert their contractile force, they exert that contractile force onto tendons. So when you look at muscles, let's say here's the forearm, these muscles generate tension, they transmit them to the tendons, that's the gray part, and then these tendons attach to bones. Muscles attach to bones by way of tendons. But muscles are the contractile portion. Tendons tend to be more elastic. They help to stabilize body positions because many muscles are postural. You have muscles like along the back, the erector spinae muscles. You have the calf muscles. Those help to maintain and stabilize your body. They are involved in storing and mobilizing substances within the body. So muscles have the ability of pumping. The pumping mechanism of muscles help to pump blood, which help to pump and circulate nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. Muscles also store sugar. Remember, glucose is stored in two places. Glucose is stored in muscle and in the liver. The storage form of glucose, if you think of it, remember anything in its inactive form ends in OGEN, ogen, right? So glycogen is the inactive form of glucose. So glycogen is stored in muscles and it is stored in the liver. When muscles contract, they generate heat. We know that because when you exercise, you get hot. When you have a fever, muscles contract and they contract rapidly, so you're shivering when you're cold, to generate heat, to raise your body temperature, to kill bacteria and viruses. Some of the properties of muscle is that they are electrically excitable. We know that because you can put a TENS unit on a muscle and that thing can contract without your control. We will talk about the neuromuscular junction shortly, and that's where nerves and the end plate of the muscle come together, and muscles contract only because of nerve supply. If we cut a nerve going to a muscle, the muscle becomes non-functional. In fact, if this is a nerve and this is a muscle and we cut it, this muscle atrophies, meaning it wastes away. The opposite of atrophy, if you're exercising muscles, muscles get thicker and bigger, we call it hypertrophy. So atrophy and hypertrophy are opposite terms to one another. Muscles have the ability of contractility. Now that term contraction can be misperceived by many people. Most people, when they think of contractions, they think that a muscle is shortening. And muscles can shorten as a type of contraction, but they can also lengthen while they're contracting, and they can remain the same length. So the term of contraction really means to produce tension. And you can have tension generated in muscles when they're shortening, when they're lengthening, or when they're remaining the same length. Muscles have the ability to extend, so we call it extensibility. There's a certain ability of a muscle to elongate, but if it elongates beyond its anatomical limits, it rips, okay? Elasticity is the muscle's ability to stretch beyond its limit to a degree and recoil back without damage. So in terms of contraction, you heard me say muscles can contract while they're shortening, lengthening, or remaining the same length. And these are the three terms to describe that: shortening, lengthening, and remaining the same length. The term concentric is when the origin of a muscle and the insertion of a muscle approximate and they get closer together. That's concentric. Eccentric is when the origin of a muscle and the insertion of a muscle move further apart. And isometric is when there's no change in the joint angle, but yet there's tension that is being generated. Concentric is also known as the positive, whereas eccentric is known as the negative. So I remember, if I would go to the gym and do a training session, sometimes I would pick one particular session in which I would just do negatives, meaning I would create a contraction where I am slowly lowering the weight against gravity at a slower pace than of which gravity can take it, right? So if I'm doing, let's say, a bench press, right? I push the weight up. When gravity is pushing down and I have no control, boom, it just falls on my chest. That's not eccentric. Eccentric is pushing the weight off of me and then slowly lowering it towards my chest against gravity. That's eccentric. We also call that the negative contraction or the deceleration because you're slowing down the movement, whereas the concentric is the acceleratory phase. So a really great way to train is ballistic, fast, rapid concentrics, and then very slow eccentrics. Great way to train muscles. Isometric is when you're holding a pose, right? Like pushing against a wall, trying to move an object that's too heavy. There's muscle tension throughout your body, but there's just no change in the joint angle. There's not enough tension that could be generated to overcome the resistance, okay? So, understanding these from a clinical perspective is really important because I use this just about every day in my practice where I have patients where I need to work with them using neuromuscular re-education where they have these shortening patterns where their heads comes forward, their pecs are so tight where their shoulders come forward and their heads come forward. I need to try and educate them on reversing that. So we need to stretch and elongate the shortened muscles and then strengthen the muscles that are elongated. So we're using concentric and eccentrics here. You always want to elongate and open up the muscles that are shortened, like the pectoralis major that pulls you forward. You want to elongate those. And then you want to strengthen the antagonistic muscles on the opposite side. Okay, so here in this particular instance where we see the individual holding a book and he's moving it up, the biceps are doing the work. So the origin is up here, the insertion is here, and they're approximating. That's a concentric contraction. When the individual is lowering the book at a slower pace than gravity, origin, insertion are moving further away. So understand that muscles attach to bones, and they have two tendons, an origin and at least two tendons, origin and insertion. So if I were to show you here on this model, here, let's say we're looking at, let me get this. Let's take a look here. And we see the biceps brachii here. The origin is up here. We could see it's 2 because it's bicep. We have a long head and we have a short head. The short head originates on the coracoid process. The long head goes through the bicipital groove and attaches to the supraglenoid tubercle. These are their origins. The insertion is down here near the radial tuberosity, just inferior to the head of the radius. You have an origin and an insertion. When the origin and insertion get closer together, it's concentric. When they move further away, it is eccentric. Okay, so let me pause here, and then when I come back, we'll start a little bit more on origins, insertions, agonists, synergists, and antagonists. So let's make sure you understand you have concentric, you have eccentric, and you have isometric. Make sure you know which one's shortening, which one's lengthening, which is remaining the same length. Know which is the deceleration, which is the acceleration, which is the positive contraction, which is the negative contraction.